Hello. In this video, what we will discuss is the details or the steps with respect to enterprise risk management. Okay. So here we'll discuss the risk management process. As we have described in the previous video, the risk management process is composed of several steps. It is risk identification, risk analysis, which is assessment, measurement, and prioritization, and risk control, and risk monitoring and reporting. And part of the enabling process or enabling environment with respect to the risk management process is the presence of an accepting risk governance and culture, and the presence of strategy and objectives, and how the entire risk process is all integrated in that strategy and objective setting process. Okay, so here we'll discuss the different steps in detail. We start with risk identification. So essentially, what is risk identification? The objective is for you to establish an inventory of risks, meaning list down all risks that the firm is currently exposed to. And what we want to do is we want to confirm those existing risks and to determine whether they're still applicable and relevant given the changing or evolving makeup or profile of an organization. Okay, a risk inventory must be updated and done annually because risks may change. The frequency, the severity of risk may change from one year to another. And at the same time, some new risks may emerge. And with the emergence of new risks, they have to be captured in your risk management process. Okay. So the frequency of risk identification will depend on how on how quickly risks change or new risks emerge. Okay. Some risks take a long time or will be pervasive in every year. Some risks depends on the season or depends on some other circumstance. For example, every election year, probably there's a separate set of risks for companies with projects in government, right? So for example, if you're Megawide, you are operating the airport in Cebu. So every 3 years or every 6 years at least, there's a change in administration. There might be some changes in policies, right? Which are inherent only on those 3 years or more pronounced on administration changes. So probably the assessment of the risk will be different as the type of risks evolve. Okay. So during risk identification, really the objective is to establish a risk inventory as a risk register. Okay. It is a listing of all risks that could impact the entity. And the idea is there has to be openness in the organization to be able to identify risks properly, honestly, and openly, so that the risk register will be complete. So as I mentioned, the risk inventory is simply a listing of the risks of the entity. Depending on the number of individual risks identified, organizations may structure the risk inventory by category. Some risks may be grouped together. So for example, risks related to interest rate. When interest rate changes, inflation changes, right? If interest rate changes, the cost of financing changes. So those can be grouped together because they can be addressed together, right? And so therefore, it can be grouped as financial risks, for example. Customer-related risks might be grouped together, or compliance-related risk, etc. By grouping them together, even though you listed them down separately, grouping them together gives you a better overview of the risks that you have on hand. Okay. The risk within each category, organizations may choose to further define those risks into subcategories, especially if these risks are very much critical for an organization. So for example, in a company like Meralco, which is a utility, operations risk is very pronounced because if they fail in operations, there will be a lot of public backlash. There will be a lot of Senate and Congress investigations if they do not do a good job in operations, in managing operations risk. And so they would probably want to disaggregate operations risk further, no? Because there might be different facets of operation risks that um, they want to manage. So there might be a case for having subcategories instead. And so it's very critical to have what's called a risk taxonomy. Okay, risk taxonomy. What is a risk taxonomy? It's basically a risk dictionary of the organization. Each organization might have a different understanding of the risk. But if you have a risk taxonomy across your organization, you have standardized what does a certain risk mean. No? An example of a risk that can be confusing is liquidity risk. Okay? When we say liquidity risk, it might be interpreted two ways. Okay? One is the risk that there will be no cash to pay for liabilities, right? A company is illiquid if they don't have enough cash flows to pay for their short-term liabilities. So that is liquidity risk, right? But liquidity risk can also be interpreted as this one. If I own shares in a company and I cannot sell those shares, it's difficult to sell those shares in the market. Okay, then I would say that I have also a liquidity concern, right? Because it's difficult for me to convert or to sell my asset into cash. There's no market for it. Therefore, that asset that I'm holding is illiquid. I have liquidity risk, right? So it might be confusing for an organization if they don't define it. So that's why part of risk culture is trying to define a risk taxonomy or a risk dictionary that everyone understands. So probably they will define this a little bit better. So probably they will rename some of these risks para their organization understands it. Okay? So that is part of the risk inventory setting. There could be new risks that will arise. Papangalanan mo yung risk na yon so that everyone in the organization have a common understanding. Okay? Now, another concern with respect to risk inventories is pag ba sinabing risk identification, what should I be thinking about? Risk on what? Okay. In our definition of risk management, we talked about that risk is anything that could potentially result in losses, no, with respect to the goals and objectives of the organization, right? However, we know that there are various types of objectives. There are long-term strategic objectives. There could be entity or business level objectives or strategic business unit objectives. And there could be specific functional objectives, right? So any event that would not allow you to be successful at pursuing those objectives is a risk. Some risks affect the strategy directly. Some risks affect not the general strategy, but an entity or an SBU's strategy, a strategic business unit. Some risks affect more than one business objectives of the same business entity. And some risks only affect some objectives of the business, is not necessarily all, or rises to the level that will impact strategy. So for example, okay, let's have Metro Pacific. Okay, so Metro Pacific Corporation has an entity level strategy, whatever that is. It has several business units, right? It has its toll company, it has its hospital company, right? All of those corporations will have their own set of objectives. Under the toll company, there's the operations department, there's the finance department, etc. Okay, and those departments have their own business objectives that support the objectives of the toll road business. Okay, and the objectives of the toll road business support the overall corporate-wide strategy of Metro Pacific Investments Corporation. Some risks, okay, impact specific objectives, like inflation, for example. Inflation risk, it affects the finance department, right? Or interest rate risk, it affects the finance department, but not necessarily affecting or significant enough to curtail the entity's business objectives. Pwedeng hindi, right? Or it might not be not significant enough to affect MPIC corporate objectives, right? So you have to realize that risks might be benign, meaning not that deadly, or risks can be so significant that it affects strategy altogether. No, for example, regulatory risk. Regulatory risk affects the toll road business directly, right? No, political risk may affect overall strategy directly. Okay? Pag may political risk, ayaw ka ng presidente, right? Kahit anong gawin mo, lahat ng yung strategy mo might be curtailed. So any business unit affected, right? So it affects strategy directly. No, regulatory risk, of course, is present in toll roads. So it affects business unit objectives directly. Okay? Pero for example, operations risk, for example, risk of non-maintenance, rather risk of wear and tear of roads, no? That is a business objective kasi I'm sure the ops department ang in charge dyan. It might be significant enough to contribute also to the entity to curtail entity or business objectives. So when we do an inventory of risks, we have to be aware that there are levels of organization. And so in gathering those risks, no, you have to assess it at the department level, at the entity level, and corporate-wide level. Yung gathering should be in this point of view. And then later, makikita mo pag ginather mo na lahat, makikita mo may risk na present at this level. May risk na present at this level, pareho. Tapos present din siya at the strategy level na risk. And so therefore, overall, medyo malaki yung severity ng risk, right? Because it's something that emanates throughout the different objectives of the organization. At the department level, at the business unit level, and at the corporate-wide level. Okay? What are some approaches to risk identification? Okay. Of course, these are all generic approaches. For each kind of risk or each kind of department, they might have a different way of approaching how to list down those risk items. But here are some general rules or general approaches. First is cognitive computing. In other words, para siyang studying external information. And using those external information and using data analysis techniques to try to predict the future and how it impacts the business. Okay? That's why usually you do cognitive computing for new and emerging risks. So an example is weather patterns. Okay? You can get external data, for example, on rainfall, temperature, and other environment and economic data. Do your data analysis and try to predict the outcome, no, for changes in rainfall, changes in temperature, for example, impact to consumption of soda, for example, your Coke, right? Now, when you study these different characteristics, no, and as you relate it to the consumption of sodas, it may some emerging risks may arise. Nakita mo, significant na pala yung temperature, impact ng temperature, negatively. Okay? For example lang. Okay? If that is the case, then magiging source yan na part na ng risk ko yung climate risk or climate change risk. Okay? Of course, a second way is data tracking. So past events can help predict future occurrences. So you want to get the historical information that you have, do your data analysis, so you can understand the interdependencies and of those occurrences with your objective and try to predict the outcome. Okay? Or predict the future of this. So example is, I'm sure you have internal data on failures or spoilage rates in your manufacturing process. Okay? By analyzing your historical data, you can predict whether spoilage risk is significant or even present in your organizations. So nakita mo, tumataas yung trend ng spoilage, baka significant risk na yung spoilage or bagsak sa quality assurance, okay, na mga outputs. Okay? So if you have the data, analyzing data will result in a lot of information about risks of the company. Next, of course, interviews, right? Or qualitative risk identification. So we want to solicit an individual's knowledge of past and potential events. No? For example, documenting key events from employees with institutional memory, consulting experts within and outside an organization. For example, in the organization that I was part of before, part of our risk management process is to get economic or to attend economic briefings by different banks. So we invite different banks and we ask them, what is your prediction for the economy next year? No? So economic briefings ang tawag doon. And based on those economic briefings, meron makakaroon ng themes yan, right? What are the risks for the economy next year? And probably those risks, based on the experiences of the company, can impact the company's risks and risk makeup. Okay, so interviews are definitely part of it. Next is key indicators. You look at the KPIs of the company. Baka may mga KPIs dyan na palagi na lang under-deliver. And probably you need to investigate it. Baka may risk na yan. No? Kasi palagi siyang under-deliver. Okay? So basically, para rin siyang data analysis, but this time with the focus of trying to analyze the trends in your key performance indicators within your company. Okay? So for example, nakikita mo maraming audit findings ang accounting unit. Okay? Dati ang audit findings, internal audit findings, mga 5 lang. But it has been increasing over time. 11, 12, 25 findings. Baka meron tayong internal control risk. Okay? Because the key indicators are telling us that internal audit findings have been increasing and probably the quality of our internal processes decreasing or degrading. So with those key indicators, it might indicate some risk that needs investigation. Process analysis. So you want to develop a diagram of a process to better understand the interrelationships of inputs and versus outputs. Okay. So for example, you can review a credit evaluation process for a bank to determine whether an applicant's loan application will be approved. By process analyzing it, right, you may be able to identify weaknesses in processes and therefore risks can arise because of that. Okay? Or risks can be identified because of that. And the most usual is qualitative workshops. Now, this happens every time in any organization. There are risk management meetings where risks are collectively discussed in an organization at pinag-uusapan, okay, in several workshops, and usually those are called Delphi method. To have members of an organization go through several rounds of workshops to establish consensus on the risks with respect to the company. Okay. Obviously, these are not all encompassing, because some of these risk approaches can only identify some risks. Okay. For example, okay, process analysis. If you do process analysis, it might be able to identify existing and new risks, but not emerging risks or risks that are really out of the current situation of the company. Okay? Data tracking, historical ang pinag-uusapan, so baka existing and new lang, but not emerging ones or malayo pa. Sa kumbaga, paparating pa lang na risk, hindi pa yun nakikita sa historical information. Right? And so therefore, you need to, in terms of the approach, you need to use several of these techniques to be able to unearth the risks of an organization. Okay? And usually, in unearthing the risks of an organization, it is a bottom-up approach. Okay? In terms of risk identification. Usually, the sections identify their risks, na-elevate yan to the department level. Okay? And then all departments will meet for the SBU risk, and all SBUs will meet for the corporate-wide risk. Okay? Kasi yung risks identified by the section, some may be significant enough for the department to pay attention. Yung department risks, some may be significant enough for the SBU's attention. Yung SBU risk, some may be significant enough to cover or to be taken up in the corporate-wide risk management plan. Okay? And that process of discovery involves different types of approaches. Okay? In establishing a risk taxonomy, as I mentioned, so it's critical to also have a risk taxonomy or risk dictionary so that risks and how they are described will be understood uniformly across the organization. Okay? Na-explain ko na yung liquidity risk, which is my example for confusion in terms of risk labeling. That's why risk taxonomies are important. Okay? And an important sub-process of risk identification is the development of a common definition across the enterprise. Okay? This will help you in terms of risk identification. Okay? Now, what's the output of risk identification? Okay? Each level of the organization must define their objectives, and that's part of the strategic business setting. Once they have defined their objectives, they are now in the position to identify the risks. No? There is no risk if there is no objective. Right? Kasi ang tinatry nating i-catch is what are the items that will not allow you to attain your objectives. So each of these departments within operations, for example, may mga subunits yan like quality assurance, plant operations, facility maintenance. Marketing department, may mga subunits yan like branding, PR, media. Okay? Or probably by brand, yung organization. Each of them merong objectives and therefore there are risks. Okay? And the risk inventory should be at all levels. So pag na-analyze na ano yung risk ng buong ng mga different operation subunits. Okay? Pag-uusapan at the department level, what are our objectives at the department level and what are the significant risks related to that objective. Tapos pag nagawa na itong tatlo, pag-uusapan at the strategic business unit level. What's our objective and what are our risks? Okay? Pag na-identify na yan, pag-uusapan at the corporate level, what is the corporate objective and what are the risks of not attaining those corporate risks. For example here, the sales team, for example, no, each of them will list down their risk. Okay? At later, pag-uusapan, alin dyan ang significant, alin ang hindi. So, objective lang sa risk identification, identify mo lahat which risks are significant to the entity. Okay? Now, after risk identification, the second step is risk assessment, measurement, and prioritization. So collectively, we call this risk analysis. Okay. So when we talk about risk assessment, what we want to do is to understand the severity of each. And when we talk about severity, impact and probability is being assessed. Probability or likelihood that the risk is going to happen, impact or the amount of the loss that we are expected to achieve, or the impact, whether that's qualitative or quantitative impact. Okay. Risk assessments provide input to the design of the risk response. Okay. Because usually, if severity is high, kung mataas ang severity, edi syempre concern ka sa risk na yan. Right? And so therefore, the risk response or sometimes called the risk action plans will be aligned with its severity. Okay? So dahil severe yung risk na yan, marami tayong risk action plan para hindi mangyari yan. Severe yan eh. Pero kung yung risk na yan, mababa ang severity, baka pwedeng wala na tayong gawin kasi pag nangyari naman, naka-budget naman yan. Right? For example, risk na nawawala ang papel sa isang opisina. Papel, meaning papers. Meaning there are risks, for example, that the papers are being wasted. Okay? Wasted supplies. Okay? The probability of that happening is high, but the impact is very low. Dapat pa bang magkaroon tayo ng specific methodology so that we can curb the use of supplies in a company? Right? It depends whether it is worth it. And the risk action plan or the risk response is commensurate to the severity of the risk. Okay? Now, the assessment of severity is also at multiple levels. Kanina, ang risk identification at multiple levels. That's the same discipline for the assessment of severity. Okay? Kasi something might be severe at the department level, no? Pero pag inakyat mo sa strategy, maliit lang pala yon versus corporate-wide. No? So for example, may objective si plant operations. Ang impact niya is, for example, 100,000. Pag inakyat mo kay SBU, yung 100,000 significant pa rin. Pero pag inakyat mo kay corporate, yung 100,000 CCU lang. Right? So, something might be tagged severe at the lower levels, but tagged as not severe at the higher levels. So, you need to actually analyze it at different levels. For example, here are 4 examples. No? So some business objective level risk retains severity at higher levels. Okay, so for example, let's say this is toll road uli. I mean, let's continue with the MPIC example. Toll road hospitals. Okay. Of course, marami pa siyang subunits pero dalawa lang muna. Okay. So for example, one risk on toll road is the risk of non-approval of tariff rates. Meaning, for example, Calax is an MPIC project. Okay? So, Calax is MPIC. For example, nag-apply sila ng increase in tariff rates, toll rates. Okay? Pag hindi yun na-approve, pero significant ang impact, right? At the toll level. Okay? And it could also have a severe impact at the corporate level. Kung for example, toll is toll roads is, for example, 70% of total revenues. E di yung non-approval ng tariff rates in this business unit has a significant effect on the corporate unit. So in this case, na-maintain yung level ng risk as it goes higher in the organization. Meron namang mga risk na probably, okay, at the department level, severe, pero nawawala yung importance niya as it goes up in the organization. Yun yung sinabi ko kanina na 100,000. No? We spend, for example, 100,000 on supplies. At the department level, it might be significant. But when you increase it or discuss it in the corporate level, yung 100,000 pala, sisiyo lang. Kasi mas marami pa kayong ibang problema, yung overspending. Right? So, naging moderate na lang siya. At dahil doon, pagdating sa corporate level, lalo na siyang hindi significant. So, in that case, the overall severity is low at the enterprise level, right? But it is high at the department level. No? Why is it important for us to understand this? Because the risk response will also change. Okay? So therefore, the risk response here is at the department level only. Hindi kailangan ng significant resources dyan. Okay? So kayo, magtipid na lang siguro kayo. Right? Or find budget from another line item to pay for that 100,000 overspending. Okay? Kumbaga yung problema ng department na yun, in other words, hindi problema ng lahat. So solve nyo yan. So the risk response is within that department. Versus this one. Yung problema nila, problema ng lahat. Okay? So the risk response is also commensurate to it. Since it will derail strategic objectives, then the risk response is also equivalent to that. Okay? So kung non-approval yan, di gagawa sila ng paraan para ma-approve. Okay? Whatever that is, talking to the regulator, talking to the Department of Finance, etc. Okay? Another is some business level risk may increase in severity at higher levels. Okay? Kasi at the lower levels, pwedeng benign lang siya or pwedeng medium lang ang level of the risk. Kasi ang nakikita lang ng department na yon yung risk niya. Pero hindi niya alam, the other departments also see the same risks. Okay? And so nung nag-usap-usap sila at the SBU level, parang problema pala yung lahat yan. So naging significant na, severe na. No? And then when it goes up to the enterprise, hindi siya problema ng kabila na business unit. So bumababa ulit yung level of severity of the risk. Okay? So in that case, the risk response will be at this level kasi mukhang hindi niya problema yun eh. Right? So it won't require enterprise resources. It will only require SBU resources. Okay? So meron din naman na benign in the latter units, pero it has a significant impact pala in the overall business objective. Okay? So in other words, this just emphasizes the fact that we need to assess risks at different levels of the organization. Okay? Now, what are some severity measures? How do you measure severity? So severity is two things, di ba? Probability and impact. Okay? So management selects measures to assess the severity of risk, no? And the severity measures usually align to the size, nature, and complexity of the entity. A smaller company will have a lower tolerance for risks, and therefore their measures might be more simple than others. Okay? So different thresholds may also be used at varying levels of an entity. So for example, pwedeng mababa ang risk threshold for a department versus a business unit versus a corporate unit or enterprise-wide. Okay? So when we determine severity, as I mentioned, there's impact and likelihood. Impact is the result or effect of a risk. Okay? Since we're talking about effect on business objectives, right? The impact of the happening of the risk, okay, might have financial or non-financial impact. Okay? But I'm sure eventually they will have a financial impact, but probably not in the immediate term. Okay? So the range of possible impacts are determined in this case. No? So the impact may not have an immediate financial impact. For example, reputational risk. Okay? The impact may not necessarily be a direct profit and loss impact, but it will be in terms of finding difficulty in finding suppliers or obtaining government permits kasi pangit ang reputation mo, right? And so eventually, it will have a financial impact, right? If you can't find the right suppliers, what will happen eventually? Your cost of inputs will increase, right? And due to that, may financial impact rin, right? But it's not direct or it's not immediate. Contrast that against demand risk. When there's a reduction in demand, definitely lower sales. So there's an immediate cash impact. So itong mga ganito, mas madaling i-quantify ang impact. Okay? Pero here, the impact for reputational risk might be more qualitative, no, than quantitative. Right? Likelihood is the possibility of the risk occurring. So probability of risk. So it might be expressed in terms of probability and frequency, and likelihood sometimes is difficult to determine in terms of probability or frequency, right? So minsan qualitative rin yung analysis ng likelihood. Okay, for example, what is the likelihood of reputational risk happening? You cannot quantify the probability of that, or you cannot possibly say na one occurrence of reputational risk, patay na, right? So therefore, there might be some qualitative aspects, okay? Or some other non-qualitative aspect, some other qualitative aspect that can be quantified. Okay, so for example, reputational risk is low if hindi tayo nadyadyaryo. No instances of negative media coverage. Ang reputational natin, risk natin, medium ang likelihood if high chance or medium chance, no, of negative media coverage. Ang reputational risk natin, high if 3 times a year may negative media coverage. Okay? In that case, you are able to quote-unquote quantify a qualitative characteristic, right? So those are some ways to quantify something qualitative. Okay. So in determining severity or likelihood, the likelihood can be expressed in a variety of ways. So here are some examples. It can be qualitatively, quantitatively, or through the definition of a frequency. For qualitative, for example, so it can be expressed this way: the possibility of a risk, happening. Okay, the possibility of a risk relating to a potential occurrence or circumstance, and the associated impact on a specific business objective is remote, for example. So, i-define mo na lang, what do you mean by remote? Okay, it's remote because, for example, no negative media coverage the past 10 years. So, therefore, I can say that the reputational risk for us is remote. Pwedeng ganun. Okay? Dinidefine mo na lang bakit mo nasabing remote. Okay? And that's a qualitative assessment. Of course, quantitative assessment is to have a probability attached to it, 80%. Okay, and then frequency can be a way to determine severity. If it happens once every 12 months, that is the frequency of occurrence. Okay? And the possibility is once every 12 months. So that is pag mas frequent within every 12 months, then mas mataas ang likelihood, then it becomes more severe. So pwedeng in terms of that. Okay? So severity is something that is qualitative most of the time. And it also depends on your understanding of the business. Okay? So for example, you're a public utility like Manila Water. Regulatory risk is always high, right? And it's because of your understanding of the business. Okay? Alam mo that water is an emotional good for people, meaning protective ang people with respect to their access of water, right? And feeling ng mga tao, kawawa sila pag wala silang tubig, which is normal. No? And it springs from our understanding of the business. So therefore, pag nawala ng tubig, no, malaki ang impact sa reputation, sa regulatory risk natin. Right? And therefore, you expect regulators to have very close scrutiny on the operations of a water utility. Magagalit ang tao sa kanila as the regulator. No? So regulatory risk is naturally high always. Okay? Versus other businesses, for example. So yun, hindi na kailangan na maraming paliwanagan, right? Because everyone knows it's high. Because anytime the regulator can always pick on them, especially under a specific administration, for example. Okay? So medyo feelings na yun or qualitative na talaga siya. It's difficult to quantify it. Ngayon, there are what are ways to quantify something. For example, risk of non-collection, mabibilang yan eh. Right? How big is the risk of non-collection of receivables? It's something that can be gleaned or can be analyzed from data. Right? So the chance is 30% hindi nagbabayad on time. So we can really determine severity that way. Okay? Right? So another thing that we need to understand is that severity, the assessment of severity, should align with the strategy and business objectives of the business. Okay? Business objectives of the organization. Okay, in our example, okay, so for example, the objective for the snacks unit is to develop innovative products that excite interest and excite customers. Okay, right? Now, they have identified the risk, which is internal failure. The possibility that organization fails to develop new products, that is the risk that they identified. Okay. Now, the way you analyze severity and likelihood, severity is based on or in relation to the target or objectives of the company. In this case, the target is 8 products in development. Okay? So dapat makaproduce sila ng 8 products under development at all times. Okay? So that they can develop innovative products that excite customers. Right? Now, you will also define, aside from the target, your tolerance. What is your tolerance? This is the variability that's acceptable to you. Kasi 8 is just an estimate, right? So merong range yan na acceptable for you. That's your tolerance. Okay? Now, since 8 is the objective, if it is within a tolerance of 6 and 12, risk pa rin yun. So for example, 8 ang target, 6 ang expectation mo, meron ka pa rin risk na 2. Pero dahil it's within your tolerance, baka moderate lang ang impact to you. Right? Kasi within your tolerance naman. So tanggap mo that it could vary and it's within your tolerable risk range. Okay? So now, if for example, your estimate is 4 lang ang mani-develop mo, outside na of your tolerance, then probably the impact becomes more severe or ang impact high or ang impact assessed as high in that case because because outside na siya ng tolerable range mo. So you have to do something to make it within your tolerable range or within the target of 8. Okay? So Yun yung ibig ko sabihin that the severity measures are aligned with your target. Okay? So for example, business objectives for human resources, recruit and train product sales managers. That's the business objective. And because of that, the target is to recruit 50 product sales managers. No? And the tolerance is 35 to 50. Yun yung tolerable. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, pwedeng pag 40 or 45, baka minor lang ang impact. Okay? Pag 35, medium ang impact or moderate. Pag less than 35, severe. Okay? So, the tolerance more or less defines the impact type. Okay? So, for example, ito naman, 95% of the managers, ang tolerance niya, 85 minimum. Pag 70, severe na. Okay? So, yun ibig ko sabihin, because the objective and the risk are aligned. And so, therefore, your assessment of severity measure should be aligned also with the objective of the target and the tolerance of the organization. Okay? So the impact might be qualitative or quantitative. For example, interest rate risk, obviously, there's profit and loss impact there. But reputational risk, probably there's no direct financial impact, but there could be non-financial impact that could be quantitative or could be calculated or determined as a number. So for example, because of reputational risk, there was a decrease in rank in the ASEAN governance scorecard. Okay? May maintain kang rank in the ASEAN governance scorecard. Bumaba ka. So that's your quantitative manifestation of a qualitative risk, like a reputational risk. Okay? Assessment approaches. What are the different approaches to assess the risk? Okay? Of course, there's qualitative and quantitative. Okay? So qualitative approaches are more efficient to complete. However, of course, there's limitation because you don't quantify the amounts, di ba? Qualitative lang yung assessment. So usually you do this through workshops or you do this through consultation with experts, no, etc. There could be quantitative assessments such as modeling, decision trees, Monte Carlo simulation, etc. No? Now, the quantitative models in determining the severity of risks, that's something that you'll learn in Module 2. Because every risk might have a different way of quantitatively assessing the severity of those risks. Okay? So we'll not cover it in the first module. Now, at the end of the day, once you have established the probability of the risk happening or the likelihood, you have analyzed whether it is low, moderate, high, no? You have already assessed the impact of the risk, whether that's quantitative or qualitative, to low, medium, and high. What you can actually do is to graph those risks and create what's called the risk heat map. Okay? So the risk heat map is a graphical representation that highlight the relative severity of each of the risks and the achievement of a given strategy or business objective. So each risk is plotted on this heat map and assumes a given level of performance for that strategy or risk. So how does a heat map look like? So it looks like this. Okay. Each of those risks, risk 1, risk 2, risk 3, risk 4, were assessed in terms of their impact and likelihood. Okay. So if you look at risk 1, it has an impact rating of 3.5, no, and a likelihood rating of say 3.5 also. Okay? That's why nandito siya sa quadrant na yan or sa box na yan. Okay? On the other hand, risk 4 has a low impact but a high likelihood. Okay? Paano mo nakuha yung likelihood rating or impact rating? Each organization will design it differently. Okay? So in this organization, may rating na 1 to 4 for impact, or baka 1 to 5, no? Kasi baka 5 to pag dito sa dulo. 1 to 5 for impact, 1 to 5 for likelihood. And then for a certain risk, they will rate the risk. 1 to 5 ba yan sa impact or 1 to 5 ba yan sa likelihood? How do you determine 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Kanya-kanya ng scale yan by company. For example, for impact, okay, pwedeng ang kanilang classification is the rating is 5 if the financial impact is more than 2 billion pesos. Okay? Ang rating 4 if the financial impact is between 1 to 2 billion. Ang rating 3 if the impact is between 0.5 to 1 billion. Okay? And so on and so forth. So that could be their rating analysis or rate scorecard. Okay? So this is for impact. However, merong mga non-finance measures for impact, right? So therefore, gagawan mo ng sarili mong impact or impact rating yung bawat risk na yan if they cannot be quantified. Okay? So yun yung sinasabi ko kanina na merong qualitative aspect talaga yung impact rating. So it's not a perfect model, but it gives you a visual representation of which risks is more severe than another. Okay? And it's a good tool to be able to understand that. Okay? Yung likelihood, for example, pwedeng ang rating is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Nangyari na ba yan the past 12 months? Nangyari na ba yan the past 2 years? The past 5 years? The past 10 years? The past 15 years? No? Those can be ways to quantify the likelihood so that you can plot them. No? Kasi kung frequent siyang nangyayari, right? Like here, then 5 yan. Kung nangyari na yan within the past 2 years, then yan. So that's how you produce those ratings. So that's why likelihood and impact are actually subjective by nature kasi contextualized din siya sa organization. Right? So 2 billion, for example, might be too small for a conglomerate like MPIC, right? Probably mas malaki yung risk tolerance nila kasi mas malaki silang organization. Okay? So that's why the risk heat map is very critical and important. No? Ngayon, hindi nga perfect yan, so you have to justify the likelihood ratings. Kasi sometimes, hindi siya ganito kadali. No? For example, likelihood of political risk happening. Okay? Hindi mo naman ma-table yan. Okay? Nasa assessment mo yan ng environment. Right? So, napansin mo, pinag-iinitan ka ng presidente, so 5 yan. Next admin, napansin mo, friendly yung presidente sa'yo, so baka 2. So, it's a little bit subjective. No? And not every risk kayang ipasok in a table like this in terms of analysis. So, you have to analyze those risks individually. Okay? Okay. So, at the end of risk assessment, what is your output? No? Your output at the end of risk assessment is to develop the severity in each organization or each unit, subunit in the organization, and do a risk heat map wherein you're able to determine the impact and likelihood of certain risks happening. So pwedeng may risk heat map ka per unit. Okay? So at the sales department level, may risk heat map ka. At the business unit level, may risk heat map ka. At the corporate level, may isa ka pang risk heat map. Precisely because, as I mentioned, severity may change, no, across the organization. Okay? Kanina sabi ko yung tolerance level. The tolerance level can also change across the organization. Pwedeng sa department level or sa subunit level, narrow ang acceptable deviation. Pero pagdating sa corporate, mas wide ang accepted deviation. If that is the case, then at the corporate level, right, the severity is low. But at the subunit level, the severity of a certain risk is high. So that can happen. Okay. Now, once you have those assessed risk, the next step is to prioritize them. Okay. Why do you need to prioritize risks? Okay. Yung risk prioritization in this case, it doesn't mean that risks that are not prioritized are not addressed. Okay. All risks identified need to be addressed at a certain way. Dapat may action ka. Okay. Minsan, the action is no action, and we'll discuss that later. Okay. Pero ang point ko lang is risk prioritization in our context. Prioritization is important kasi malalaman mo anong risk ang pagkakagastusan mo. Okay? You want to allocate resources properly. Now, remember, you have, for example, you have scarce resources, right? A corporation or a company has scarce resources. And those scarce resources are usually allocated to capital projects or projects which expand value or investment projects. Some of those resources may be used for risk mitigation. No, and that's why you need a risk prioritization. Hindi mo kayang gastusan lahat, no, so that you can mitigate those risks. Meron ka lang risk capital that you can allocate. And the prioritization gives you an idea of where to put that money set aside for risk mitigation. Okay? Kasi yung risk mitigation, nakikipag-compete pa yan ng resources versus the normal capital expenditures of the firm. Normal expansion projects of the firm. So whatever capital has been set aside for risk mitigation, it has to be well allocated. And that's why you need a prioritization. Okay? So management must evaluate the trade-offs between allocating resources to mitigate one risk versus the other. Okay? And the prioritization of risk, given their severity, the importance of the corresponding business objective helps management in its decision-making. Okay? So that's the context why risk prioritization is important. We prioritize not because all other risks are not important. We prioritize because we want to determine where will the money go, which risk mitigation should be funded, and which should be not funded. No? And therefore, the risk response will be in such a way that no money is involved, or no cash needs to be invested. Okay? So what are some criteria for risk prioritization? Number one is adaptability, which is the capacity of an entity to adapt and respond to risks. Okay? So if you're able to respond agad in those risks, then probably you don't need special intervention with respect to the risk response that you're going to implement. Okay? Complexity, the scope and the nature of a risk to the entity's success. Of course, the more complex that risk, then probably you need to invest on something to resolve that risk. Okay? So for example, if your risk is related to accounting systems or internal control, no, hindi mo naman masosolve yung internal control issues ng one or two procedures lang. No, and for example, that issue is that complex. So if that is the case, then you might need to prioritize it, right? Because you need to put money or to invest money so that you can buy an appropriate accounting system to manage that risk. Okay. Next is velocity, the speed at which a risk impacts an entity. The velocity may move the entity away from the acceptable variation in performance. No? So if if madaling ma-paralyze yung operations if this risk happens, which makes it difficult for you to respond right away, then you probably need to spend more on risk response, right? And if you spend more on risk response, probably you can institute measures to make sure that you're able to go back to operating, uh, to operate as usual. Okay. So for example, having business continuity plans in place. Some of the business continuity plans need investment, right? And so therefore, kung ganun ka-critical yung risk to the point na pag nangyari siya, ubos ka kaagad or pilay agad yung operations, then there has to be money invested to make sure that you can recover quickly, right? Persistence, how long a risk impacts an entity. So the more persistent a risk is, then probably you should invest more to mitigate it. Why? Because pag mas persistent yung isang risk, the multi-year impact may be significant, right? And so therefore, it might be worth it to invest something now so that the persistence is curtailed, okay? Recovery is your capacity to return to tolerance or capacity to go back to pre-risk levels, okay? And so that probably needs some investments in the risk response as well. Now, risks of greater priority are more likely to be those that affect the entity as a whole or arise at the entity level. Okay, so usually these are the ones that are so significant that needs investment for risk mitigation, and so therefore they will be prioritized. Okay, in the allocation of resources. And risk prioritization can also occur at all levels of an entity. No, but of course, different levels of entity will also have different access to resources. Iba-ibang budget that's available from an enterprise perspective, SBU perspective, or business unit, or department level or subunit level perspective. So therefore, mag-iiba rin yung risk response nila or akma to their respective budgets. Okay. Now, what's the output of risk allocation? The output is the determination of what's called top risks of the entity. Okay? And there could be top risks at different levels of the entity. May top risks at the corporate level, top risk at the SBU level, top risk at the department level, and top risk at the subunit level. And those top risks may risk mitigation or risk response kang gagawin. And therefore, you can determine whether you will put or allocate money to those risk response. Okay. Of course, special attention is parang given to the corporate level or enterprise level top risks because usually they're so significant, right, that it affects the company as a whole. So it might require significant funding. So that's why top risks are determined at the corporate level. Now we go to risk control. Risk control, risk response, risk action plans, essentially. Okay, so those are three terms. And essentially, risk control means how to manage that risk, how to mitigate the impact, and how to and what action do you do with respect to those risks. So for all risks identified, management selects and deploys a risk response. Okay. Now the risk response will have to be determined based on the severity and the prioritization of those risks. The more severe that risks, then the risk response nakaakma kung ano yung severity niya. And if it is a prioritized risk, probably there is a budget that you can utilize to further galvanize that risk response. Finally, risk response also accounts for the performance targets of the organization, meaning for risk management to be really effective, dapat risk action plans, certain risk action plans are integrated into the performance appraisal of management or of accountable persons in an organization. Okay? So, yun ang ibig sabihin yan. The risk response should be part of the targets of people. Otherwise, sinong gagawa ng risk response or risk action plans? Di ba what is never, meron ng saying, right, na you only manage what you keep track, right? So, and if it's part of your performance target, then definitely you'll pay attention. Di ba? So that's why risk response are usually intertwined with performance targets of managers and performance targets at different levels of the organization. Now, we define inherent and residual risks. Okay. Inherent risk is the severity of the risk absent any direct or focused action plans. Okay? That's what inherent risk is. So yung ginawa natin kanina sa risk assessment, tawag doon inherent risk assessment. Right? Because we didn't consider ano ba ang risk response natin. Okay? Kasi supposed to be, if this is the risk, no? And it is this severe, okay? Pag ginawa mo na yung risk action plans, magiging mas maliit na yung risk. Right? Kasi na-manage mo na a certain portion of it. Okay? So dapat yung severity niya should decrease because of the implementation of the risk action plan. In fact, it might be the case that risk is eliminated because of the risk action plan. Right? That severity after the implementation of the risk action plan, that is called the target residual risk. Okay? So that is the severity knowing that management will implement or has implemented the risk action plan. Okay? So ang idea is with the risk action plans in place, the risk severity will be reduced. Whether risk severity will be reduced because probability will be lower or the impact will be lower, no, that will arise due to the implementation of the risk response of the risk action plan. Okay. Now, the target residual risk is your expected residual risk or target severity after implementation of the risk action plan. Of course, target might be different from the actual. So actual residual risk is the risk remaining after management has taken action and actually implemented the risk action plans. Okay? So actually, hindi naman nawawala yung risk after the risk action plan. May mga risks na magre-remain pa rin after the risk action plan because you can only mitigate it to some extent. Okay? So that's why risk response is important kasi liliit yung severity dapat as you implement those risk action plans. And that's your objective when you define your risk responses, right? The risk response, the objective is to reduce the severity. Or the risk response can be no response kasi maliit na yung severity in the first place. Huwag na nating lagyan ng risk action plan kasi hindi na cost beneficial for us to do something about it. Maliit lang naman yung risk tulad ng pad paper at tulad ng supplies in an office. Right? Kasi baka lagyan mo pa ng tracking system using barcodes, yung mga papel sa office. Right? Maliit lang naman ang severity kung meron mga wastage. Diba? So worth it pa ba na mag-invest ng that much? So baka no action plan is the action plan with respect to that risk kasi it's not cost beneficial to do something. Okay? Now, when do you actually do that? So what are the appropriate risk responses? Depende sa risk. Okay? Here are the generic types of risk responses. Generic, okay? Kasi depende sa risk kung ano yung specific action plans, right? One generic risk response is to accept the risk and or retain the risk. In other words, do nothing. I-retain mo na lang, i-accept mo na lang yung risk kasi not worth it. So when you accept the risk, it means that there's no action taken to change the severity of the risk. So the response is appropriate when the risk to strategy is already within risk appetite, meaning okay lang sa akin may konting variation within the maliit lang yung variation at talagang okay lang sa akin. Hindi kailangang lagyan ng investment. Okay? Risk that is outside the entity's risk appetite and that management risk seeks to accept will generally require approval from the board or other oversight bodies. Another way to think about it is those which have very low severity can be accepted or retained na lang without any action. Just like my supplies example. Kasi kung low impact naman, barya lang ang impact, kahit na high probability, i-retain na lang natin, okay lang. Kasi kung barya lang ang impact, wag na natin pakialaman. Right? Of course, we can put small measures in place, okay lang, to reduce the probability of it happening. No? But no need to sweat it out. No? Another is to avoid. No? When you avoid the risk, it means action is taken to completely remove the risk, which may mean, for example, ceasing a product line, declining to expand to a new geographic market, or selling a division. Okay? So choosing avoidance suggests that the organization was not able to identify an appropriate response that will reduce the risk to an acceptable level of severity. Okay? So when you avoid something, it means you want to remove it completely. So this is appropriate for high severity. No? High severity risks. Kasi the risk is so high that you cannot do anything. So tanggalin mo na lang. Do not be exposed in it in the first place. An example is risk of terrorism, for example. Okay? The risk may be so high of risk in terrorism. For example, you have an investment in Afghanistan, doon sa Kurds area, right? May investment ka doon. And then you know the Taliban has already ransacked or has already has effective control of the Kurdish area, no? So yung investment mo doon, probably the risk is so severe na baka ang only way for you to manage that risk is to disengage from Afghanistan. Seize the product line, sell the business, no? Because that's the only way. Wala ka namang ibang risk mitigation na magagawa sa terrorism. Kahit ilang security guard ang ilagay mo. Kung bubombahin yan. Right? And so therefore, in this case, the action is to avoid the risk altogether rather than mitigate it in some way. Okay? Of course, there might be some form of mitigation. Yung sinabi ko kanina, mitigation na lagyan mo ng maraming guard. Right? Palibutan mo ng 200 guards yung iyong business. Right? So that's a mitigation. Pero probably, kung ganito kalaki yung risk, after ko ng mitigation, baka malaki pa rin yung risk pero konti lang yung pinag-iba sa severity. No? And probably, this mitigation is so expensive, right? That it's not worth it to pay for this just for a minimal decrease in the severity of risk. So probably the most cost beneficial is to avoid it altogether. No? So that's one generic response. Okay. Another response is to reduce the risk. Okay. By reduce, you will have risk action plans. No? Meron kang actions to reduce the severity of risk. No? So for example, you are a risk of non-conformance of output to industry standards. or industry rules. Okay? For example, VCO, for example, ang business mo is to manufacture virgin coconut oil. Okay? Meron niyang output, and that output has a requirement in terms of purity, in terms of regulations that will make it sellable, right? The risk that we're talking about, for example, is risk na mag-fail yung product sa market. No, yung na-produce mong VCO will not pass the FDA standards, for example. That is the risk that we're trying to mitigate. Okay? So there could be a series of internal procedures that will allow you to ensure na walang lalabas na non-conforming. So for example, magbuo ka ng quality assurance department. Okay? So the quality assurance department, ang gagawin lang niya is to check all output and to random test whether they are within standards. So that could be one risk response to reduce the risk. Hindi naman perfect yung QA department eh. Pwedeng may makalusot pa rin. Okay? Second, for example, na risk response is upgrade your facility, no, to one that will have lower incidences of non-conformance. No? So by nature, yung ginagawa mo is you're trying to reduce the risk, okay, by putting investments or plans to ensure that the non-conformance will not happen. Okay? And the third way to respond to this risk is to share or transfer those risks. Okay? One way of transferring the risk is through insurance. Okay? Like fire, no? Napag-usapan na natin yan last time. Okay? The risk of fire happening or fire ravaging a facility might be high, no? Pero mahirap i-reduce on your own ang risk of fire. Right? Anong gagawin mo? Lahat ng materyales hindi nasusunog. Is that your risk action plan? That could be a risk action plan to reduce. Another risk action plan to reduce the incidents is, for example, maglagay ka ng fire extinguisher every X meters. No? Another way to manage it is to transfer that risk. Kuha ka ng fire insurance. Right? Pag may nangyari, may mag-reimburse sa'yo. Right? You can also share some of those risks. Okay? So for example, when you outsource to service providers, you're actually sharing the risks or transferring the risk. Okay? When you engage in hedging transactions, which we will go better in module 2, no? That is a way of transferring the risk. Okay? So sharing, usually ito yung ang way to respond is non-insurance contracts. Just like hedging instruments, okay, or yung binanggit dyan, service agreements, which allow you to allocate risks between parties. Okay? So here is the heat map once again, and let's try to plot the different generic risk responses to different types of risks. So here, in terms of the actions, if a risk is has a low impact and low likelihood, the suggested or the appropriate response is to simply accept the risk. Right? Why? Because probably it's too expensive to mitigate them. After all, the impact is low. Right? And the probability of it happening is also low. Correct? So why bother? Okay. The next set of risk responses, no, refers to reduce, an attempt to reduce the risk. Okay, and usually it is appropriate for items that are high probability, okay, but low impact, okay, or high impact but low probability, okay. Yung share and transfer, probably that is more appropriate for more severe risks, no? That have a higher impact even though the probability is low, just like fire, okay? And for those who have a high probability but the impact is moderate, okay? Of course, you can still reduce. It doesn't mean na hindi na pwedeng gamitin yung iba, ha? Pag nandun siya sa risk box na yon. But it's just the generic appropriate response, okay? And of course, as it becomes more severe, then you start considering avoiding the risk. And if it's really so severe, then you should avoid it, okay? So that's how also the risk impact, the likelihood, this matrix, how it interacts with the appropriate risk response. The more severe a risk is, then you move towards avoiding as the proper risk response. Okay? If the as the likelihood and impact is reduced, then tumataas yung chance that you can just simply accept the risk. Okay? Now, there are several other ways or general ways to reduce the severity of risk. Okay? So one is separation. Okay? So you can disperse the asset or activity over several locations so that you avoid interdependence. No? Especially true for production, for example, or warehousing. Okay? Pag nasa isang site ang lahat ng warehouses mo, pag nasunog ang site na yon, sunog lahat. But if you separate them, right? So dalawa yung warehouse mo, and so therefore pag nasunog yung isa, meron ka ba nung kabila? Right? So it reduces the severity of the loss. Right? Next is duplication. Okay? Kasi pag nasira yung original, meron kang backup. No? Dispersion of an asset over two locations, keeping on in reserve. So for example, ang usual na may duplication is, for example, documents. Okay? So yung documents, pwedeng nasa safe location yung original, duplicate lang ang nasa opisina mo. Right? So that's why it mitigates the risk that those documents will be lost. So pwedeng nasa safe yung original, and then the copies, yun lang ang meron sa opisina mo. Right? And so that also is a way to reduce the severity of the risk. Another is by diversification, of course. You spread the loss exposures over many investments or many projects. Just like in portfolio management, right? In portfolio management, if you want to reduce the total risk of a portfolio, you invest in more diverse portfolios, so that the risks are spread and the risks offset each other, because the downside risk in one investment might be equivalent to an upside risk on another. Okay. Now, when you select and deploy the risk response, of course, you have to take note of the following. Number one is the business context. So the response should be appropriate to the industry, geography, regulatory environment, operating structure, and other factors. Siyempre, within the confines of what you can control and how your actions can interact with the environment of the entity. Okay. Another is costs and benefits, which I've been mentioning a lot, right? Some risk responses might be too expensive and not worth it. And so therefore, you use it to calibrate the risk response. And last is obligations and expectations. So risk responses generally address accepted industry standards, stakeholder expectations, and alignment with the mission and vision of the entity. So usually, for example, regulatory risk, the risk response is in line with the regulations of the entity. You cannot initiate a risk response that you cannot do based on regulations, right? So that's something that you need to consider in terms of designing the risk response. Of course, you also need to consider the prioritization of risk. The higher the prioritization, then you can allocate resources to it. If it's low in the prioritization, it means your risk response will not involve much investment. No? So you have to consider it in the risk response design. And then the risk appetite. No, risk responses should bring you within the risk appetite. Okay. No, so there might be a combination of actions that will bring those the severity of those risks within acceptable levels. And so you have to consider them in the analysis. And also, there could be several risk responses for one risk, or one risk response can impact multiple risks. So those interactions also need to be considered. Another is risk severity, right? The more severe it is, then the more intense the risk response should be, pursuant also to a prioritization schedule. Generally, the costs and benefits are commensurate with the severity and prioritization of risk, as I have mentioned. Okay. And then costs and benefit measurements for selecting and deploying risk responses are made with varying levels of precision. Because obviously, in the first place, the severity is an estimate. So the direct costs with respect to the risk response is also an estimate. And you cannot put a quantitative tab every time. No? So you just have to determine it based on financials. If not financials, probably level of effort. Is the level of effort commensurate to the benefit that we're seeing based on the risks being mitigated? Okay. Management is also responsible for risk responses that address any regulatory obligations. Okay. Which again may not be optimal from the perspective of costs and benefits, but you have to comply with. Okay. So for example, you were given, your regulator asked you to upgrade all facilities to comply with strict NVI standards. Ang paniwala mo is kaya naman ng current mong operations to comply with the NVI standards. Okay? But because the regulator asks you to upgrade, probably you have no choice but to upgrade. So in that case, then cost-benefit analysis, wala na yan, right? Because you have a legal obligation to do so. Okay? Sometimes it's regulation, sometimes it's the industry dictating on you, right? That you have to do something. Okay? And that's why you have to view risks as a portfolio. Remember, when you assess risk, you determine its severity. After the risk action plans are implemented, yung risk mo lumiit ang severity. But they are still there. There are still residual risks, right? And because there are still residual risks, you have to be aware how much residual risk are you still holding. So you actually have a portfolio of risks that you need to ensure that you are updated with. You have to ensure that you are you know whether the risk action plans are materializing, because those risks are marbles that you're holding, right? And so you should consider risks in terms of a portfolio. You want to minimize your portfolio of risk as much as possible. Okay. And since you have a marble, you have marbles representing risk that you are holding. You need to also decide how are you going to finance if those risks happen. And that's what risk financing is all about. Okay? How do you pay for the losses after they occur? That's the problem of finance also, to determine how to manage that. So methods of risk financing are risk retention, non-insurance transfer, and commercial insurance. Okay? What's retention? Retention means you are self-financing the risk. Okay? Meaning, wala kang ibang magagawa but to muster up the funding for it when it happens. Okay? So retention is effectively used when no other method is available. You cannot insure it. You cannot transfer it to another party. So you're the ultimate party who needs to bear it. Okay? The worst possible source is not serious. Kasi if it is serious, then probably mauubos yung kumpanya. If this happens, then probably the risk response should be to avoid rather than reduce. Okay? So it affects your risk response if you don't have the risk financing to do this. Okay? And the losses are highly predictable. No? So a risk manager can pay for those losses using current income, using fund reserves, or a credit line. Basically, funding sources, spontaneous funding sources. Kasi pag nangyari yung risk, hindi ka naman makakautang agad, right, to finance that risk, or makakakuha ng private placement to finance that risk. Dapat maitawid mo muna yung crisis before you can rebuild, right? And so therefore, you need to have the funding to cover for it. Okay. Now, what are non-insurance transfers? Non-insurance transfers are methods by which a pure risk and its potential financial consequences are transferred to another party. Okay? So, you want to transfer the risk to another party or you want to allocate the risk to another party. So, tawag dyan risk transfer or risk allocation. Okay? So when you transfer it to another party, how do you do it? Usually through contracts or leases or hold harmless agreements. Ano example ng contract na non-insurance transfer? For example, you own a building. Okay? And then you rent it out. When you rent it out, you sign a lease contract, right? Ikaw ang lessor, ikaw ang may-ari, no? When you rent it out, you sign a lease contract. In the lease contract, you say, for example, that any damages will be paid for by the lessor. Any damages, whatever is the form, kahit sino ang may kasalanan, those damages will be paid for by the lessor. Isn't that a way of transferring risk from you as the owner to the lessee? Sorry, paid for by the lessee. Di ba sinabi ko lessor or lessee? Lessee ata ang sinabi ko. Okay. It's paid to be paid for by the lessee. Okay. Isn't that a way to transfer risk? No, risk of degradance or degrading. The risk of degrading facilities or degrading building. I transfer that risk to the lessee through a contract. So I was already able to manage that risk by transferring it through a contract. Right? Pag may nangyari sa building, hindi ako magbabayad. So, yun na yung way ko to finance that risk. Ask others to pay for it. Okay? Another way is insurance. Right? When you insure something, then definitely you get a payout when the loss exposure happens. And the payout is something that you use to compensate you, for the risk that's happening. Okay? You'll learn more about insurance in the module on insurance. Okay? Now, what is the output of the risk control or risk response portion of risk management? The output is for each risk at all levels of the organization makagawa ng risk action plans. Okay? Again, what I mentioned is for all risks, dapat may action plan yan. And part of the action plan is to retain or accept. Okay? Part yan na pwede mong ilista sa action plan. Hindi ibig sabihin lahat may kailangan may gawin na nakakaiba. Okay? And now for prioritized risk, now we consider the budget for risk mitigation. Okay, you want to outline the acceptable risk financing, no, as part of the risk response. Okay. Now you want to assess the target residual risk for an item and evaluate the remaining residual risk so that you know the portfolio of risks that you are holding. Okay. Now, if those residual risks are not tolerable, nakita mo ang dami pang malalaking risk. Ibig sabihin kulang yung risk action plan. Okay? So ibalik mo sa management. Dagdagan niyo yung risk action plans niyo. Masyado pa tayong maraming risk. Or sabihin mo sa management, i-avoid na natin yung iba. This is just too plenty. No? And then you have a portfolio decision, right? Which risks should we avoid or let go? And that means letting go of it in the strategy also. So that's why strategy and risk management is intertwined. So at the end of the day, you will see something like this, right? You've got the probability of the risk happening, magnitude or the impact, likelihood, okay? And then meron kang mga marbles, no? And the size of the circle is proportional to the strength of the risk response. So alam mo ngayon na may mga risk akong weak ang risk response. Ano yon? Risk C, no? To some extent, risk F and H and D. Sila na yung next na pinakamaliit. What is risk C? Government policy uncertainty. Ibig sabihin, kahit anong gawin ko, ang risk niya is high talaga, ang magnitude, low and high ang probability, and I have very limited control over it. Right? And so you need to decide, should I avoid this? No? Kasi you need to also see that your portfolio of risk is heavy na ba on smaller items. Okay? If you look at letter B, pinakamalaki ang risk response ko dyan. Getting the work done. Okay? Or operations risk. Okay? So if you look at risk of your final risk outcomes this way, then you can envision that you have a portfolio of risks, right? And sooner or later, you'll have to decide that something is so significant enough, the risk response is so inadequate that the risk that I have is still very high. And so therefore, further actions can be done, such as to avoid that risk. Okay? And that is the outcome of the risk management process. Okay? Of course, even though that's the outcome, it means that we won't stay there. We need to monitor and to report those risks. Okay? So the last step in the process is to monitor the risk management program and the risk management process. Okay? So once you have the risk management policy statement, you may want a risk management manual, but at the end of the day, what you want to do is to monitor the risk identified. You also want to monitor the risk severity, whether they are still the same as how you imagine them initially. You also want to monitor the risk responses, whether they are being implemented or not. Okay, and those monitoring, of course, feedback or provides input to the next ERM process. Okay. A successful risk management program requires cooperation from all departments in the firm. Okay, the program needs to be reviewed and evaluated regularly, and the review and reporting should encompass updates on the status of each risk, assessment whether there was evolution in the risk, nag-change ng severity, nag-change ng frequency, status of the implementation of risk responses, and highlighting of issues encountered by the company to implement the risk action plans. And of course, these reports should be elevated to the governance structure of the company and should be visible to both senior management and the board as the ultimate oversight bodies for risk management. And that's it. So in this video, we're able to go through the entire risk management process. Okay, thank you.